In this second video, I want to focus entirely on parasitism, and I want to make a couple points. First of all, parasites typically manipulate their host, and secondly, they typically have pretty complicated life cycles. So first of all, let's talk about mosquitoes as parasites. Mosquitoes are pretty important parasites. They're external parasites, or ectoparasites, as we learned earlier, and they're also really important for humans. So if you look at all of these different causes of death, you don't really need to worry about sharks killing you or wolves killing you. Elephants, maybe. Hippopotamus, who knew? They're pretty dangerous. Crocodiles, yeah, not so much in the US. Tapeworms, surprisingly far more than sharks. We have to go way down here. Dogs kill a lot of people, and snakes, yeah, not so much in the US. But as long as you stay away from them, you'll be okay. Humans clearly are a huge cause of death. But besides disease, the biggest thing to kill people is mosquitoes, and most specifically, mosquito-borne diseases. Many of these mosquito-borne diseases are still really common throughout the world, including malaria, which is one that still has a massive impact. Both of these things influenced by parasites. There's a parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, which is the cause of malaria, but there's also the vector, the mosquito. If you add up all of the deaths caused by mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases, they have killed more people than all the wars in the world's history combined, which is pretty amazing. Mosquitoes are fairly generalized parasites, although they can be kind of specific, but many parasites have very specialized life cycles. Let's take this example of the liver fluke, or the lancet fluke. It undergoes different parts of its life cycle in 3 different hosts, so it requires 3 different hosts in order for it to complete its full life cycle. This is a cycle, so we can start anywhere we want, but where we're going to start here is with the cow. So the adult fluke produces eggs inside the cow. The eggs get pooped out by the cow or any other large grazing mammal. So historically this wasn't necessarily in cows, but it could have been in lots of other animals like deer, elk, all sorts of other large herbivores. And then in their pile of feces, things like snails and slugs will come along and eat those eggs in the process of eating other things. Now when they do that, they are essentially and accidentally transferring eggs of the parasite into the next host. This host then is the place where the parasite develops a little bit more. Those eggs hatch, they produce offspring, and then the snail releases those offspring in slime balls, which are, oddly enough, attractive to these ants, which is the next phase of the life cycle that the fluke develops in. So they develop in this other host, and in this other host, the parasite grows throughout the entire host, but part of what it does is it takes control of the brain and the nervous system of the ant, gets the ant to climb to the top of a grass blade, hold tight, and that's a perfect place to end up into the gut of a grazing large herbivore. So especially in this stage, the parasite has manipulated the host to basically do its bidding. Now it's not done this intentionally. It has no idea why it's doing this. Both parties are just sort of responding to a cascade of hormones or other kinds of signals that selection has acted upon over thousands and thousands of generations. But take a look at this from the lancet fluke's standpoint. It has to adapt to 3 different hosts, and these 3 different hosts have defenses against those lancet flukes. Those hosts are influencing the traits of the fluke, but the fluke is also influencing the traits of the host. Remember that issue of coevolution in the previous video. So if you're a parasite, it's a pretty tough life, because you've got to be adapted to very different kinds of environments. Now lots of parasites have these similar sorts of adaptations. This is another example. This is a berry this is a berry, this is a berry. This is the rear end of an ant, which looks a lot like a berry. Normally the rear end of this ant, known as the gaster, the rear end is known as the gaster. Normally the gaster looks kind of black like the rest of the ant, but this ant has been infected with a parasite, and that parasite has caused the ant to climb up onto this branch, grab a hold of the branch, and then it also lightens the cuticle or the exoskeleton of the ant so that it now looks like a berry. And so when birds come along, incidentally birds are the next host for this roundworm, when birds come along, they eat a berry, oh, accidentally eat an ant butt, and then the parasite has been transmitted. Again, parasites typically have very specialized life cycles because they're adapted to several different hosts, and secondly, they tend to manipulate their hosts in ways that encourage the hosts accidentally to transmit that parasite to the next stage of the life cycle. There are also lots of parasitic fungi. Of course, there are things like athlete's foot, which many people can get, and that's a parasite, although it doesn't really reduce your fitness much. But then there are other kinds of parasites, like these pseudoflowers that are produced by fungi. If you look at this white flower in the lower left-hand corner, that's what the plant normally looks like when it's flowering. But when it's infested with this fungal parasite, it looks like this yellow thing in the middle. That yellow thing is attractive to bees, and bees come along and land on it thinking that's a flower, but then once they're there, they realize, wait, there's no nectar here, I'm going to move on. And so what the bee does is it moves on to another place. It's thought that it's attractive to bees because that flower looks a lot like other flowers that bloom at that time. So that plant gets infested with essentially a fungal venereal disease. It's transmitted through reproduction from these bees, and then it gets transmitted from plant to plant. There's one kind of parasite that maybe you've heard about that occurs in a lot of cats, and that parasite is called Toxoplasma gondii, and it causes this disease known as Toxoplasmosis. Toxoplasma gondii is very unique in the way that it invades host cells, and it also replicates, but it's also unique in that it modifies the behavior of its hosts. Its typical host is a mouse, and when it's in a mouse, it makes a mouse act, or other small rodents. It makes those rodents act more bravely, they take more risks, they forage or they look around for food at different times of the day than they normally would. Basically, they make them more likely to be eaten by predators, which are cats. Now, toxoplasmosis is frequently found in cats. Some areas of the world, it's upwards of 80 or 90% of cats have toxoplasma. It doesn't really cause many symptoms in the cats, but if it gets into a human, it can have some very severe side effects. For example, there is one hypothesis out there that people who are infected with toxoplasma tend to go a little bit crazy, tend to act more risky, and tend to attempt suicide at higher rates than people who are not infected with this parasite. So there might be something to the crazy cat lady theory after all. Here's another way in which parasites can manipulate their hosts to allow transmission to other hosts. This is an example of a mussel that occurs in streams in the southeastern U.S. Alabama, incidentally, has more different species of mussel than any other state in the country, which is pretty amazing. Here's a mussel that has what looks like a little fish attached to it, but that's not actually a fish. That's actually a little lure that's part of the mussel. There's some great videos on the Moodle page showing this lure in action. So what the mussel does, if it wants to reproduce, if it had any wants at all, pardon the teleology, if it wanted to reproduce, what it would do is it would have to release a whole bunch of gametes. Now the problem is, those gametes get washed downstream. How on earth is a mussel going to get upstream? Well, the way they do that is to encounter some fish and get the fish to do the work for them. So they release this fish lure that is still attached to them, and when a predatory fish comes along and attacks the fish lure, the mussel releases a whole bunch of these small offspring known as glaucidia. These glochidia grab a hold of the gill rakers of a fish, and they're parasitic for a short period of time. The fish swims upstream and downstream, and eventually these glochidia have taken enough resources from the fish that they are able to survive on their own. They drop off, they burrow into the rocks or substrate of the stream, and then they can live for 70, 80, who knows, maybe over 100 years. So this is how mussels get up and downstream. They don't swim very well, they don't move, they don't crawl, but they get fish to move them around. And they're parasitic in part during that kind of migration period. Kind of makes you appreciate mussels a little more than you otherwise might. There's one kind of parasite that is especially interesting. It's known as a parasitoid. It's kind of like a predator in that it ultimately kills its host. It's also kind of like the typical parasite that we've been talking about so far. But like many of the other parasites that we've talked about, they're very specialized and they manipulate their hosts. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a wasp parasite, or parasitoid, who is laying an egg in a little aphid. And in the upper right, there's a caterpillar that has been infested with a whole bunch of parasitoids. In the lower left, you see the parasitoids on the inside of that caterpillar. All those little things that look like white grains of rice, those are little larval parasites or parasitoids that are eating the caterpillar from the inside out. In the lower right column, you see a picture of a caterpillar that I found once, and that caterpillar was very, very aggressively defending that mound of parasitoids that had emerged from it. So it's pretty crazy. The caterpillar has been eaten from the inside. During that whole time, it's eating leaf material, basically not in a way to help itself, but in a way to feed those parasites. And when those parasites finally emerge, they come out and they kill the caterpillar, but not until the caterpillar has spun a silk cocoon around all those parasites or those parasitoids, and not until that caterpillar has defended the parasites or the parasitoids from other things coming along to attack it. Again, there's some awesome videos on the Moodle page that you've got to check out. And some of these caterpillars, when the parasite comes out of them, they just turn to this mush, and all of these things are individual cocoons of little parasitoids, which will emerge as adult wasps and go on to sting other caterpillars. Now note, humans do not get parasitoids. We get parasites, but we don't get parasitoids. But this idea of parasitoids was something that inspired lots and lots of science fiction movies, including that whole Alien series. So here's another example of a really weird group of parasites known as brood parasites. So in the upper left here we have a kind of a bird called a cowbird. There's one of many species of different kinds of parasites, brood parasites. What brood parasites do is they will lay eggs in the nest of other birds. Those eggs typically look a lot like the eggs of the host species, the one that's being parasitized. And then when the chicks emerge, you can see they are much larger. Here's the warbler, and here is the cowbird. So this is the parasite. They're typically much larger, and the mother responds to that cue of the really large red mouth. So when she comes back with a whole bunch of food, that's the one she's going to feed first. These guys either starve or get kicked out of the nest. So this has lots of impacts on the host. Reduced body size of the host, because the female just keeps feeding and feeding and feeding in this one, and she doesn't get to feed herself much. Reduced fitness of the host. Typically her offspring will die. The offspring of the host are typically either killed violently by this one pecking at them or kicking them out of the nest, or by starving. And they can have pretty serious negative side effects on the populations of the host birds. Here's an example again of a brown-headed cowbird being fed by the mother bird of a totally different species who thinks, oh, that's my baby. No, you've been fooled, you've been parasitized. One last final example of parasites. So remember that I said parasites typically have specialized life cycle. Here's a case of something known as an isopod, which is related to roly-polies and things like that. A fish swimming in the ocean comes along and eats a tiny little baby isopod. That isopod grabs a hold of the tongue of the fish. It eats the entire tongue of the fish away and then basically replaces its tongue. It sort of acts like the fish tongue. Now that sounds terrible to us, and it's probably a little bit painful. But you know what? Ultimately, they've found that this fish suffers no negative impacts at all in terms of lifespan, in terms of fitness, total reproductive output. No aspects of its fitness is reduced. So is it really a parasite? Most people will think of it as a parasite, but when we talk about commensals next, we'll realize, hey, maybe that's more of a commensalism than it is a parasitism.